Hello, my name is Paul Zanazanian, and welcome to History in the Now Conversations, a podcast on history and how we use it in our everyday lives. History in the Now Conversations explores how we use history to know who we are, to know how to think and feel, and to know how to engage in our daily routines. History in the Now Conversations examines what history is, what it does, and how we can use it or even should use it in our everyday lives. Today's guest is Lauren Bialystok, an associate professor in the Department of Social Justice Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, also known commonly as OISE, at the University of Toronto. Lauren holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Toronto, and her research interests span topics in ethics, education, and identity, also touching upon feminist philosophy, social and political philosophy, and women's health and sexuality. Lauren is in the process of completing her second book with the tentative title, Learn Who You Are, Identity and Authenticity in Education, with MIT Press. She is also co-author with historian Lisa Anderson of Touchy Subject, The History and Philosophy of Sex Education, published by the University of Chicago Press, 2022. This book was presented with the Outstanding Publication in Justice Award from the Philosophy Branch of the American Educational Research Association in 2024, which is amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Lauren is also the co-editor with Bruce Maxwell of the 6th-volume anthology, Educational Foundations, published by Bloomsbury in 2023. Lauren's new research project looks at the effects of generative AI, artificial intelligence, on the aims and meaning of education. Lauren, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me, Paul. It's really a pleasure to be here.
The breadth and width of your work is quite impressive. Could you please tell us a little more about your research interests? And also, if you can, please explain how they have all led to your current interest in AI.
I suppose it begins in undergrad, where I was privileged enough to get a very liberal arts education. I was at the University of Pennsylvania, and I had wide interests in the humanities and social sciences. So when it came time to choose a major, I was a bit stymied. And I realized that philosophy was the subject that would allow me to think about all the different other things I was interested in. And that also, of the courses I had taken so far, philosophy was the subject that still most perplexed me. And it continues to perplex me. It's a wonderful bottomless well of perplexion. So I majored in philosophy. I went on to do a PhD in philosophy, but I'm fond of literature. I'm interested in history. I'm interested in current events and politics. So it was natural for me to take my philosophy in various applied directions. And when I landed at OISE, which is the Faculty of Education, as you mentioned, I quickly pivoted to working in philosophy of education, which I had not worked on in my PhD. And I found that philosophy of education was also a very fertile ground for thinking about all of the ethical and political issues that concerned me, and combining empirical and theoretical work. I was able to teach and write with my old philosophers whom I'd studied in my university years, but also constantly learning about different theorists, interdisciplinary work, and supervising students doing interesting work in many different empirical areas. So that has allowed me to branch out to constantly learn new things. But I would say that the thread, if there is one, certainly in my published work, is ethics and identity. I've always been fascinated by the philosophical questions related to identity and authenticity. And everything I do in philosophy sort of revolves around ethical and normative questions. So what has led to my newer interest, my project on artificial intelligence, which I'm starting to just get off the ground, is not at all an interest in computer science or technology. That's never been my area. I don't understand technology. I'm a late adopter of technology. It's almost ironic that I would be the one to work on AI, and I have a family of some very talented programmers. However, as soon as generative AI became ubiquitous, which is to say the launch of ChatGPT in 2022, I quickly realized that I could no longer take for granted many normative and pedagogical features of education. So that's to say both the aims of education, what are we doing here? What are students supposed to learn and why? And how do we teach them that and how do we assess that? And I think the ethics of assessment is a very important area in education. And of course, there was already a lot of literature on the ethics of assessment. But the introduction of ChatGPT and all of its many descendants now threw such a wrench in everything that we thought we had figured out about the ethics of assessment. And I feel like most teachers and instructors, but I'll focus on higher education where I work, most instructors like me were really hung out to dry. We didn't know how to respond. It happened overnight. Our institutions were scrambling to pull together a response, and when they did, it was fairly generic, and they mostly have advised us as individual professors to make up our own policies, which is to say we all have to become experts on AI. So I actually didn't want to research AI. I felt like I had to, and I felt like hopefully if I do it well, I have something to contribute because I have one foot very squarely in education and one foot very squarely in ethics. And I'm familiar with some of the ethics of AI work that's been done, but it's mostly outside of education. And of course, now there's a ton of work in education on AI, but most of it is not philosophically informed. So my reluctant project is to try to make sense of and provide some theoretical guidance for navigating this really bizarre time we're living in.
You mentioned ethics of assessment earlier. Could you tell our listeners what you mean by ethics of assessment, or what is meant by ethics of assessment?
Oh, sure. I don't know that there is even an agreed upon definition. I just kind of threw that phrase out there. It's my notion of this, an umbrella term for this area. But we make countless choices as educators, of course. And at least the way our education system is currently structured, assessment, which sorts and ranks students and gives them both formative feedback for improving and learning more, as well as feedback that can determine their futures. This is built into our system. There's no way around it, no matter how much you want to emphasize qualitative over quantitative, no matter how much you want to break down barriers to students who want to pursue further education. And that means that we're always making ethical judgments about the value of a type of work. We're passing value judgments all the time, and we're passing judgments not only on individual students and their work, but on what should be learned in a course, what type of assessment is appropriate. And we've gotten lazy in some ways. In the humanities, of course, we've been relying on the essay as the default form of assessment for decades now. There were already critiques of that, but it still survived for reasons that I think mostly make sense. And now we can't assign a take-home essay without knowing that many students will avail themselves of artificial intelligence or beyond what we say is legitimate anyway. And it can't be proven, even if it can be detected. It's changed the whole game. So I think that there's a lot of ethical questions now. So the ethical questions are, assuming we have to go on assessing students and assuming that the kinds of things that the essay and other written assignments were supposed to show still matter, like critical thinking, careful reading, argumentation, writing. If those things still matter, we have to rethink what it means to fairly assess students' learning of those skills. And I don't have an answer. I wish I did. So please don't ask me what we do instead of the essay. I'm working on it. But that's what I mean by ethics of assessment. writ large, and why, especially for those of us who are in writing intensive fields, the appearance of ChatGPT has totally upended any consensus we had on how we should assess students and what we should assess them on.
Are these very scary times, or are they times that are presenting interesting challenges that we will overcome?
I'll say 2 out of 3. To me, these are very scary times, but I'm not referring only to AI when I say that. And I also think that there are challenges that we may have new hope of better addressing, possibly with the help of AI, depending on who's doing the addressing, under what conditions. Overcoming, I'm less confident about. Depends what we're talking about. I'm concerned about, like most people, I would think, the rise of fascism, the rise of xenophobia, the rise of disinformation and tribalism. And AI stands to exacerbate all of those things. That's not because AI is inherently bad or can't be used to potentially find cures for cancer. That would be wonderful. But AI is a tool that, especially in the hands of certain people, unfortunately, I think acts like a steroid for the kinds of ills we're already dealing with. So in that respect, I find it very scary.
I remember I heard you talk a little while back at the beginning of the summer at the pre-conference of the Canadian Philosophy of Education Society. And there was one key takeaway idea that I took away with me. And that
curious
was,
to hear.
Well, people were talking about how do we remain human? What does it mean to be human in the face of AI? But one thing in terms of education that I took away was that we have to make sure that learners are able to think for themselves. And that was like a main message that I got from your presentation and the other presentations. And I was wondering whether that's a good takeaway, or should I nuance that takeaway a little more?
I think that's a good takeaway, and I know it sounds like a naive tagline in some ways, and I can already think of all the ways that people come back and say, but what does it mean to think for yourself, and do you really think kids or students were thinking for themselves before AI or anybody was? And that's all relevant. But yeah, the point I wanted to make and that I'm still working on is we've always outsourced some of our thinking to other people, experts, to various devices, and with the rise of digital technology, to computers and machines. And that has usually enabled us to accomplish things that we wouldn't have accomplished otherwise. But we have to be very conscious of what we outsource and when we outsource it, or else we're not building up our own brain capacity to obviously do the thing ourselves, but I think even more importantly in the face of generative AI, B, to decide whether the output that we get from the machine is what we want. And there's a lot of hype about AI literacy or, updating information literacy and media literacy to incorporate AI. And I'm worried that's really naive about our psychological capacities, because to know that AI might hallucinate, say, 1 out of every 50 times you ask it something, really doesn't give you a roadmap for deciding when to trust it or not. So if you're not capable of doing the research yourself or deciding whether a sentence written by AI is what you really mean, and you have to have written your own sentences to know that, I think. I don't think you can just know that in response to something that's fed to you. Then we are, I think, offloading too much of our cognitive abilities, our writing abilities, and our judgment to this super duper algorithm that can do not just 1 or 2 things that we can offload to it, the way that calculator, you can offload mathematical operations and it's very reliable, but you can offload countless things. And who is going to be the supervisor of what that algorithm is doing? I think we need our own intelligence and our own education and practice doing many of these tasks ourselves to decide whether outsourcing them is an advantage or not.
Very interesting. If I'm not mistaken, I know one of your main interests well, driving your interests right now is you've worked on the notions of identity and authenticity. I was wondering if you could provide some insight about your thoughts on identity and authenticity in light of the current work you're doing or your prior work. And I was wondering, where does agency fit in? Would identity and authenticity result in agency, or is that too simplistic?
Wow, what challenging questions.
Oh, sorry.
No, I'll take the last one first, but if I forget some of what you asked, feel free to prompt me again.
For sure.
On agency, no, I don't think that there's any equation between identity, authenticity, and agency. My overall posture with respect to authenticity is a skeptical one, at least when it comes to personal identity. And that's what my original work in philosophy was about, and it's continued to occupy me a lot. There is, I think, coincidentally, a really interesting element of authenticity in the AI discussion. And that was another entry point I had into this, because it seems to me that the availability of generative AI, which can spit out a new text on a prompt rather than copying something that was already written and maybe exists on the internet, is a new form of originality. And originality is what we assumed we were after when we asked students, for example, to write their own essays. And originality is very closely related to authenticity. I would say that authenticity, in theory, reflects something like a true self. So if a student is writing something authentically, that means more than just that they're the ones writing it. It also espouses some ideal of truth about who that person is, which is what I'm mostly skeptical of. However, I think originality is not that elusive a criterion, and we want to be able to trace ideas or written texts to an individual person and the workings of their brain. We want to understand what's going on in their mind. And that's why we're using these kinds of assessments as a proxy for finding out how much students have learned and how good they are at the tasks of the discipline. So now I for sure strayed from your original question, but I think authenticity and originality, which I originally, no pun intended, which I explored at first in the realm of personal identity, who am I, what makes me me, what makes you you, those kinds of questions, has a huge purchase as well in educational values and in culture writ large. We care that things are what they say they are. We care that we can, or we used to care. I mean, this is what might be changing. We used to care that we could trace things to the origin they claim to have. So, having the right origin is one definition of authenticity. And I think part of what's very eerie, at least to me, about generative AI is that it mimics this hitherto human-only process of putting out something that is unique, that we assume came from an individual person's mind, but we know that there's no person behind it. And I find that uncanny. Uncanniness alone is not a reason to reject a technology. It's just my first reaction to it, and I think a lot of people have that reaction. It's exciting in some ways because then you can have some of the fruits of what we used to think of as originality without the messiness of finding people, coordinating conversation with people, getting past all the other things that the baggage that humans bring with them. But I think there's limited uses for that. And it's definitely worrying when people start transposing all social relationships up to and including, by the way, romantic relationships in marriage onto an algorithm, or I don't even know what to call it. It's not even machine sounds wrong because it's not like a specific piece of hardware. You can't even see it. But let's call it ChatGPT. That sounds like it comes from a person, but it doesn't come from a person.
So in history theory, there's always this understanding of unexpected happenings that tend to disrupt the flow of our lives, and we tend to look to the past to somehow understand what's going on and to move forward, let's say, to maintain some kind of normalcy in our lives. So it's a way of dealing with unexpected happenings or contingency. And some people talk about the idea of unprecedented change. And because, let's say, climate change is unprecedented and AI in many ways is unprecedented, to what extent would you characterize AI as an unexpected or unprecedented happening that offers a series of new challenges that could maybe be very disruptive to our understanding of our place in the world, our relationship to time, for example?
Right. Well, I guess I'll answer that in two ways. The first answer is, from a technological standpoint, I don't know. I'm completely inexpert, although I was listening to something recently about how Alan Turing, from the moment that he created the machine that was used in World War II, that I think became the sort of first general computer, he already predicted and seemingly aspired to artificial intelligence, specifically language generating artificial intelligence like we have today. So perhaps it was expected, depending on who you ask. But I can't speak to the technological moments in that history. But the other way I'll answer it is, yes, I think it's clearly different and disruptive. So in education, for example, some of the ways I described, I think it throws so much of what we could assume about the educational project out the window. But not only education, I just happen to be situated there. And I don't know what more to say about it. I find it overwhelming, especially in concert with these other forces in the world right now. You know, you mentioned before looking to the past as something that can anchor us in new times. And that makes total sense. One of the things that worries me a lot, which was already happening before AI, but as I said, I think it stands to be exacerbated now, is that we can't agree on the past. And the disinformation and the bubbles and the conspiracies and all those things that we already know that have been hugely ramped up with social media and with political developments over the last 10 years or so, they're putting us in a more precarious relationship to the past than I think modern society has had in a long time. I won't speak to society before there was a lot of written documentation and everybody was literate. But if you take, sort of modern society where everybody's literate and the past, at least in terms of factual history, is well documented, I think, it was easy to ignore parts of the past. It was easy to not teach parts of the past. Our education system conveniently glossed over colonization and the genocide of indigenous peoples, for example. But it's not that there wasn't evidence of it or that there was fake evidence of an alternate history. And now, with all of those things and deep fakes and bad actors and aid, to go back to your question about agency, unaccountable agents, like an algorithm has agency. It puts things on the internet, but it's not accountable. It's not a person. We can't be sure that we have the same anchor anymore. And I have heard that, there's a very clear example of this. Trump has already, as soon as he took office the second time, been erasing things from the internet, from the government's websites. He's been erasing government history. That should make our hearts stand still. That is a horrifying choice about what to do with the past. So that's one very powerful person doing something that is known when he's doing it. But I think there's also all kinds of surreptitious and less coordinated or even less human-driven disruptions going on, so that evidence can be removed without a trace, or fake stories, fake videos, fake accounts of the past can be forwarded and made to look as convincing to an unsuspecting reader as what historians would call the real evidence.
And that information would feed into AI, like into
Which information? No,
like the fake information, or when people play around with the traces of the past and the future. Basically, when there's a record, like a filming, let's say, of an event, and then someone goes back and doctors it, and then there was no evidence left anymore of something that happened but no longer seems to have happened. The example I'm thinking of is, I can't remember the name of the singer, but there was this singer who was singing at this big event and she hit a wrong note. And people were surprised because she's known for singing really well. And then when people went back to look at the recording, it was completely doctored and she was singing perfectly well. And I think there's this guy on social media who documents such activities where real live events are being filmed and then something happens and the person involved doesn't want that to be a part of the memory of that event. So they go in and obviously they have power and money and they kind of doctor it and remove things or tweak things. And then they put it out there as if nothing happened, as if that was the real event itself.
That's a good example. And imagine that happening to an event that's far more serious than, a music concert. There's a war and there's evidence of atrocities being committed, and the evidence is changed or goes missing, or any number of ways to manipulate that.
And wouldn't that information go into not the machine, but ChatGPT, as you called it earlier, and then it's going to generate the information that is fed into it?
Well, all of these AI platforms are trained on existing data. Again, this is not, the technology is definitely not my forte, but my understanding is that whatever garbage there is out there already, ChatGPT and its ilk are consuming in order to be trained. And they have taken steps to filter out the more noxious things on the internet. So there's actually humans whose job it is to filter out the racist, violent, sexist things on the internet while training an AI so that the AI doesn't normalize that. And that's why ChatGPT is actually as tame as it is, because if you were just a person scouring the internet, you would find a lot of shocking things that ChatGPT won't tell you, actually. But that's not a very reliable system. So yes, AI is trained on whatever humans say exists, because AI is not human. And if humans say this exists and this doesn't exist, then it is just a matter of time before that becomes the, quote, knowledge that AI is relying on when it answers questions and provides new text.
So there is a role for academics to play to some extent.
I hope so.
Okay, let's talk history.
Okay. I feel like we've already been talking history, but let's continue talking history.
Let's continue talking history. What's the first idea or image that comes to mind when you think of history? And why do you think that image comes to mind?
Well, I think of my father, which is not the kind of image you probably had in mind. You were probably thinking more of a setting or a moment. But my father, who is still alive but retired, was a historian and also an educator. So I never studied history much myself, but I felt like I grew up with a constant history educator.
What was your father's name?
Franklin Bialystok.
And what was his area of research?
His area was Canadian history and Jewish history. And he was a pioneering Holocaust educator in the 1980s in Toronto. And he was also the only child of Holocaust survivors. He is the only child of Holocaust survivors. So I grew up with a very heavy dose of dark history that felt so proximate, even though my life was safe and privileged and all of that. And I was also close to my grandmother, who lived to a very old age and had a great memory. So I learned a lot firsthand. I learned a lot about that history firsthand. My father interviewed survivors, did workshops where he'd bring survivors to high school students, things like that. And, a room in my house growing up was just filled with my father's books and my father's work. And when we traveled as a family, which we did a lot, there was always so much history to be learned, which was wonderful. It's like having a very informed tour guide almost anywhere you are, but particularly Jewish history. And that's why that's the first image that comes to mind for me, and also, of course, the influence of how I feel about history.
What's the earliest memory of your connection? So when you think of history, the first image that comes to mind is your father, the historian. What's your earliest connection, your memory of your earliest connection?
I guess it depends what we mean by history or whether I was conceptualizing history as a child. But I can tell you that there's no recent history for a child that's harder to conceptualize than the Holocaust. And this was in the 80s, so it was even more recent. And I had to somehow make sense of this history that was my own family's history as well, without going crazy. And it was I remember being very scared. I remember as I slowly let in more realization of what the event actually was, I found it difficult to reconcile my historical consciousness with my actual place in the world and just my desire to, feel free as a child. But my father helped, and I felt, my parents and my family were protecting me as I did that. And I remember when I was only about 4, we were in Israel, and we went to Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust memorial there. And it's not very graphic, as I recall. I don't recall being in a museum and seeing graphic images, which I certainly did later in other museums and things. But I was a very young child, and I just remember that we were at the memorial, and my father cried. And that was part of how I came to appreciate the enormity and really the ineffability of this event. It's not even about words. We were standing in front of this, I think it's like a hall of mirrors with a candle, and so you see this candle reflected in 100 different ways, and it's very affecting. And I saw that even my father, whom I admired and who was an adult and who was knowledgeable and who made me feel safe, that he was crying. So that's a moment that stands out and I guess captures some of what I felt like my earliest experiences with learning about that history were.
You earlier expressed certain challenges, if I may use that term, with regard to your historical consciousness and trying to digest the horrors of the Holocaust that affected or impacted your family directly. Did you feel a sense of responsibility? That you had to pay attention and give love to your father and your grandparents?
Mm-hmm. My grandfather died before I was born. That's why I just mentioned my
your grandmother, my apologies. Are you able to live your own life today authentically, or do you think the weight of the tragedy of the Holocaust that's very direct impedes you to some extent to being authentic in your own life, living Lauren's life? Or do you feel like you have a sense of duty and responsibility to your grandmother and to your father for the work he's done? You don't have to answer this question if it's heavy.
I love that question. I feel I get to live my life. I feel like that's the greatest gift that my parents and grandparents gave me. They went through all of that and they built up the life that they did so that my generation, my sister and I and others, now my children, so that we could live our lives. And I do feel that honoring that and being responsible is part of my authentic life. As much as I might bristle at the notion of authenticity, I do feel that's part of who I am, and that's part of what I'm meant to do. I didn't go into history, of course. That wasn't the only pathway. That wasn't the only way to do it. But I will tell you that I watched my father wrestle with it, and I've had many conversations with him about it. And for him, he, as the only child, and he was born in Poland. He was also an immigrant. He was born in Poland right after the war. For him, it was non-negotiable, and it's not because someone told him you must do this. It's just what he felt called to do. And he also loved history, and he studied history and geography, and he was a student of history.
What was non-negotiable for him? Just to follow your line of
keeping the
work?
memory of the Holocaust alive.
Okay.
And teaching about it. So what many people may not realize today is that between the end of the Second World War and around the 1980s, I think in a lot of North America, but I know for sure in Canada, it wasn't just that the Holocaust wasn't on the high school curriculum and it wasn't something that many people knew much about, but also many Jewish communities weren't talking about it much, because for the Jews who were already here, it was, as you can imagine, incredibly difficult to accept what these refugees who came after the war told them had happened. And there are also cultural differences between, the Jews who saw themselves as Canadians and the Jews who came as refugees after the war, who took longer to assimilate into the Canadian community. And that's what my father's research was about. So in the 1980s, he was a high school teacher in the Toronto District School Board, and he started consulting with the board and collaborating with others and other anti-racist educators to develop curriculum on the Holocaust, on genocide, on fighting racism. And so I saw him take on that mantle. It was something that he felt called to do, and then he worked in high schools, and then he later did a PhD and did his research.
He was very resilient.
And there's a whole other dimension to the story, which I haven't even mentioned yet, which is that he had liver disease and almost died at the same time as all this was happening, and he got a liver transplant, and he's been alive 27 years since the liver transplant, which is another
impressive,
which is a miracle, and which is another thing that he taught me about resilience and gratitude and not taking life for granted.
So I'm going to ask a question, and I don't know if it's a good question, but it's a question nonetheless. When you think about the Holocaust, because it was really, to some extent, unprecedented in many ways. There were genocides prior to the Holocaust, but the scope, the breadth and width of the Holocaust was quite unprecedented. And now we're talking about AI, which is, to some extent, unprecedented. Could we draw parallels between, in terms of you facing the confusion or the overwhelming nature of the Holocaust, and you can't put words to it? Could we draw some parallels or no parallels to the confusion maybe that we face towards AI? Obviously, they're two completely different moments in time and completely different events, but I'm talking about the feeling or the emotions involved with this idea of how do you make sense of it? It's crazy.
I think you can, and I hadn't thought of it before, so thank you for that question. Very out-of-the-box question, but I like it. Without reducing one to the other, obviously, I think it's fair to say that they both ended a certain form of humanism.
Interesting. Wow.
After the Holocaust, not the first genocide, but the most systematic, the most extensive, and the most documented genocide, the first industrial genocide, I believe it was Adorno, I believe it was the philosopher Theodor Adorno, said that it didn't just kill all the people that it killed, but it killed something of the human spirit. And I think he had a piece called Poetry After Auschwitz, or he said, there is no poetry after Auschwitz, like poetry died in Auschwitz. And I think that can be interpreted in different ways, and I'm not going to purport to explain what he meant or what the best philosophers think of that. But I think it also speaks for itself in the sense that when you're confronted with such a crime against not just individual humans, but against humanity, and the very phrase crime against humanity, I believe, was coined after the Holocaust, you have to ask what humanity consists in and what of human accomplishment or human spirit or whatever word you want to use is worth preserving. And in a totally different way, what I was referring to before is I do despair about how humanity and what makes humans humans will survive and thrive in the face of AI.
So it's a similar threat in a way.
I think when AI writes poetry, there's something very threatening there. It's not just a question of is it good poetry or bad poetry, or will ChatGPT do a better job than ChatGPT-5 do a better job than ChatGPT-4? It's a question of who gets to write poetry. In fact, what do we mean by write? Because AI is not writing, not in the way that humans understand the word writing, and writing starts with humans. So what does it mean to say that poetry is spat out through an algorithm and appears on our screen without a human? It's certainly not as one-sided as something like the Holocaust, but there's, to me, a dark side of it and a very open-ended side of it, which is that this poses a new threat to humanism and the humanities, the things that make humans human and that up until now only humans did. And so that's the connection I see.
It's very interesting. It's food for thought. Could you please describe a moment in time, be it an incident or an episode in your professional or everyday life, where you had to justify the importance of using history for attaining a goal or making some kind of positive social change through your work or through your actions? And what was your justification for using history?
I feel like I use history all the time, actually, in my professional work. And it's more of an ongoing justification than a discrete incident that I can recall. But I can give you maybe a few examples. I work in the Department of Social Justice Education, which focuses on mostly contemporary and recent critical theories, such as Black studies, Indigenous studies, critical disability studies, and the like, queer theory. And therefore, most of my students are there to study those things, and most of my teaching, at least, is intended to create a conversation with those disciplines, even if those aren't my specific disciplines. And I think everybody in our department and in the community that I work in is united in wanting progressive change and wanting, more liberation and more freedom and more equality for people. So how does history figure into that? There's so much to read, and you go to grad school to delve deeply into sometimes very difficult texts, and you don't have time to read all of them. And that's always the case, no matter what discipline you're in. But I remember, when I went to grad school in philosophy, everybody had an undergrad in philosophy. And so there were some basics that we had all shared already. My department is interdisciplinary, and it's an all-graduate unit. And our students don't have any shared academic background. They may have some, broadly shared political values, some broadly shared interest in humanities and social sciences, but there is nothing that you can confidently assume all the students have started with. And the readings that are assigned in most of the courses in my department are recent or contemporary. It's very, end of 20th century, beginning of 21st century, because that's when the relevant, theories and practices were largely devised. And when they do go back, I would say, Fanon makes an appearance sometimes. Fanon is mid-20th century. And Foucault, who's 1960s, 70s, died in 1984, is often referenced, if not read deeply, in many of these social justice education areas. But what I find is that my students, no matter how well prepared they are in their respective fields and how interested they are in the material, are lacking intellectual history, as well as actually political history, that makes more sense of what they're reading. And we know there's always the story of young people reinventing the wheel and political movements reinventing the wheel. And on the streets, when there are protests and political movements, there's always somebody 30 years older who says, oh, they haven't learned anything since 30 years ago. I remember when we were saying the exact same things. But intellectually, if you're studying it from a theoretical perspective, I think it's a mistake to pass over the moments that came before. So, for example, this semester I'm teaching a course on Foucault. Foucault is a philosopher and historian, but also neither. Depends who's asking and who's categorizing. But he's a very, very wide-ranging, influential theorist who comes up in many progressive fields. And so there had been a course on Foucault, and I have different colleagues who've taught a course on Foucault because Foucault kind of belongs to everyone. But Foucault was trained in philosophy, and he is directly refuting and building on some identifiable philosophers and intellectual traditions with which most of my students are unfamiliar. So I decided to create a course called Foucault in Context. And we read a lot of Foucault, so a lot of work from the 70s and a little bit in the 80s, but I take them back to Nietzsche, who was Foucault's most influential forebear, and to Marx and to Freud. And I go back and forth in time between the 19th century and the 20th century and also talk about the relevant political events at the time to show both how Foucault is radical and where he's actually not inventing the wheel. It sounds like he comes out of nowhere. It sounds like he came up with all these great ideas, but he's building on these traditions. It's especially interesting because some of my students may have fairly averse associations with someone like Nietzsche. And in some cases, they don't want to be reading any dead white men at all. So I do see it as part of my task to not tell, but show them why a really deeper understanding of the theorists they're interested in and the kinds of social justice movements that they feel strongly about necessitates understanding the intellectual trajectory and how many giants' shoulders everybody is standing on all the way down, even if they're standing on them by opposing them. You had to have Kant to get Hegel, and you had to have Hegel to get Marx, and there's no thinker without no thinker is an island, right? No thinker has no starting point. So I try to teach that way, especially when I'm teaching Western philosophy, which is kind of an anomaly in my department. I ended up in it. It's kind of serendipitous, but no one comes to my department specifically to study dead white men or Western philosophy. And that is largely what I teach. So I'm trying to illustrate the continuities and discontinuities that can enrich a contemporary understanding of social justice education. And if you still, hate them, or if you still want to disagree with some theory or person who came before, know what you're critiquing. I think there's a very reactionary tendency in some circles to dismiss before really understanding what seems to be archaic or conservative or indefensible by some contemporary standard. And it may be, but you should know what you're critiquing first.
So in a way, you're trying to help your students take critical distance from the claims they make or the way they use the theorists that they do. Are you insinuating that Foucault and others are used in a more ideological manner, or is that too heavy-handed to assume? and you want to provide context so that they're able to see the bigger picture and say, wait a second, what they say could be flawed, or there could be another way of interpreting it, or maybe that's not correct, and I believe in a different perspective.
Yeah, I think that's broadly what I mean. There's definitely a current in academia, and maybe in some parts of academia in particular, to oversimplify and either idealize or summarily denounce particular thinkers or movements or time periods. And I think that's, shoddy from an academic perspective. But it's also dangerous politically, because if we're working in progressive political areas where the theory and the history matter, we're going to interfere with our own progress if we ignore the lessons of the past, and if we try to reinvent the wheel, and if we dismiss allies or neighboring agendas and neighboring thinkers who could actually be of assistance in our own work. And so that's a tendency that I do see and worry about.
And we're seeing a lot of the consequences in the world around us today.
Unfortunately, yes. I think extremism begets extremism begets extremism. I think when people feel threatened and overwhelmed, they revert to simplifications, because that's what we can handle. That's how our brains are wired. And simplifications can be dangerous.
You're probably reading my mind. I'm trying to connect this to AI somehow.
Well, AI, everything connects to AI. We're overwhelmed for good reason. I think in some ways it's marvelous that the world in the space of 40, 50 years has become so interconnected, so transparent. The amount of information at our fingertips is beyond what any previous thinker ever could have expected, no matter how educated and well-resourced they were. It's a total game changer. And it can and has to some extent really democratized knowledge. So and built perhaps intercultural understanding. I think there's a lot of value in all of that. And our brains are not made to process that amount of information. And our brains are certainly not made to process competing information, or information and disinformation and shades of information all at the same time. The amount of critical thinking and brain power that would be necessary to really, sift through everything that a person can come across in a day on their Instagram feed or Google News or whatever they're using, I just truly believe is beyond human capacity. So here I'm speaking as an armchair psychologist. I'm not a psychologist either, although my mother is, so I come by that half honestly as well. But I just experience it myself. I just think anybody who observes their own mind at work sees that we are blessed and burdened with more information, or things masquerading as information, than a human mind can contend with. And that makes us feel overwhelmed. And I think that makes us long for and revert to things that feel uncomplicated.
Interesting. So to recap, when you gave your example about how you used history in a prior life experience to convince people to look in a certain direction or to attain a certain goal. And so your justification ultimately would have been that you used history as a way to open horizons, to open perspectives, to other ways of thinking. Mm-hmm. So based on what you've said, what do you think history is? What does it serve to do?
Do you mean the study of history? Do you mean knowledge of history?
Yes, that's a good question. I'm coming at it. I was told by some listeners that I should talk more about my book in the podcast, because a lot of these questions come from the book, Historical Consciousness and Practical
Great.
Life. So I view history as something that's embodied. and that provides the context and background to our sense making. And ultimately, history involves time and the interpretation of time. And our historical consciousness basically refers to our interpretation of time for knowing and acting, right, in time.
Okay.
But
Small things.
But I wasn't necessarily coming at it from that angle. So you can answer it in any way you like. Maybe you can divide it up and say history as...
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's good to know, because I do think that what I would say history is or what it's for depends very much on which angle we're taking on history. I like your embodied consciousness and that version of history kind of living in us, and it really obviously resonates with what I said about my first memories and why I think history is so important, especially as I look at the world today. I think it's important to know where you came from and where other people came from. I think it's important to feel that, especially for those of us who are very, very privileged, and I think, most of us in universities in Canada today are among the most privileged people who've ever walked the earth. It's important to have a perspective to see how we landed here, and not think you hit a triple because you woke up on for third base kind of thing. And that's something I obviously got a lot from my family. I heard Maya Angelou speak once. The late Maya Angelou, the late amazing Maya Angelou. And one refrain that she kept coming back to in her kind of spoken word speech was, each of us has been paid for. And I just loved that, and it really sat with me. And she was talking about all of the things that have happened in the past, but especially the suffering and the innovation and the hope and the resilience and the working together that have allowed us to be where we are. Each of us has been paid for, and we walk around with that. That is how we ended up where we are. So we each have a connection to history if we're open to it, if we're willing to look for it. It may not be as stark or as traumatic in everybody's case, but it's there for everyone. Nobody just, dropped out of the sky. So that's one way of thinking about how history is always
So we
present.
could use it for self-realization purposes. It would be a mode of reflection or a way of thinking or a way of investigating.
It definitely could be. I guess I'm thinking of it more in terms of the value of remembering that everything and everyone has a history, rather than making judgments anachronistically or without context. It's that context piece again. I think philosophy is intellectual history, especially if you're reading a philosopher who is carrying on a specific conversation. So I'm already understanding my material and teaching the material that I love by thinking of it as a kind of history. And I think that the people that we interact with in the world and events in the world that we read about are also like that. Understand that this didn't come out of nowhere. I think it can orient our value system. I think it ties into ethics too. I think, a value that I learned very clearly while growing up without anybody sitting me down and teaching it to me as an ethics lesson is that you appreciate what has enabled you to enjoy the life that you have now. And that usually involves a lot of sacrifice and a lot of suffering.
So is history something that's done at a personal level, or can it also be done at a collective level?
No, it can certainly be done at a collective level. Yeah, I like that entry point of like the person who is walking around with history in them, and there's maybe an imperative to reflect on that. But collectively, for sure, and I'm really worried about the limited history education that our society, the younger generations are getting. I think that you can't learn all of history, but there is so much undisputed, important history that young people seem to be oblivious to, and it needs to be done in a very coordinated way, especially as we're facing these new threats of evidence potentially being erased, or alternative narratives and fake accounts being perpetuated instead of what historians would consider the real history.
So based on the dangers you just listed, would history be a lot like cultural memory to some extent?
I always end up back where my father was. Even if I'm trying to think for myself, he's imprinted himself.
Did
on
he
me.
ever tell you what history was or what history is?
He was interested in how collective memory constructs the historical narrative that people come to accept as history.
That's interesting.
And you can't rely only on memory. I think cultural memory can also be very unreliable, perhaps even more unreliable, because we have stories we need to tell ourselves. I'm guessing from your last name that you're Armenian.
Yes.
My father always refused to go to Turkey because they never acknowledged the Armenian genocide. And like I said, my father was a Holocaust historian, and he was therefore alert to other genocides, and some of them never achieved any kind of place in the curriculum or public knowledge. And I'm sure that Turks didn't want to remember the Armenian genocide. And I'm sure it would be very uncomfortable for young Turks today to suddenly have to contend with that. It was, for example, a long, difficult process in Germany but they were open about it, and they eventually, made it a mandatory part of the curriculum in Germany. So we have reasons for remembering and we have reasons for forgetting, and I would never want to rely on something as selective as human memory, whether individual or collective, for accounting for history. But of course, there's a role to be played there. And I think that respecting a cultural community's memory, especially of their suffering, is an important part of taking history seriously. But history is composed of so many different varieties of evidence and record and story. I wouldn't say it's just one thing.
I think earlier you were also talking about your father's work, how he connected collective memory to history.
Mm-hmm. He was interested in how the Holocaust came to assume the place that it did in Jewish memory. And this is something that would also probably come as a surprise today. But in the Jewish community, for the first 40 or 50 years after the Holocaust was not, except among survivors, that is, was not the defining event in Jewish history, was not at all the defining characteristic of being Jewish. It was much less connected to Jewish identity than it is today, and arguably it's gone too far in the direction of forming Jewish identity for many people today. But that was a process. That was an evolution within the Jewish community and among sections of the Jewish community, survivors and people who were already in Canada before the war, Israelis, people who lost family members, people who didn't lose family members. And that was a kind of collective negotiation. And as the Holocaust came to be more recognized and entered into the mainstream curriculum in the broader society, at least in Canada, of course, then it was a different element of Jewish identity for Jews, because it was something that they weren't just carrying themselves, but it became more acknowledged, as you said, as kind of the most extensive genocide of the 20th century, if not ever. And that's one way that collective memory or negotiations within a community about, meaning making out of a traumatic event can give historical events a certain character and importance that they wouldn't have otherwise. But I don't think it's right or wrong. I don't think it's like the community will eventually land on the correct collective memory, and whatever they deem the historical event to be, that's the ultimate truth about it. I think that it's, like I said, a process that's in flux, because you could say it also has come to be too defining in some ways. And it's a process that has to be informed by other historical sources and other societal priorities and understandings.
So, based on what you've said, based on your understanding of history as a form of meaning making, is history a good thing or can it also be a bad thing?
I wouldn't apply the terms good or bad to history.
Or to people's uses of it?
Well, it can be used, it can be abused, as a famous philosopher said. And I'm not the one to define what the abuses are alone, but there's some clear ways it can be abused. So history is, I suppose, like AI, it's like a tool or something to be interpreted. And it's always humans who do the interpreting. I would greatly emphasize the importance of history education. Done properly, of course. What does it mean to do it properly? I'm not going to give you a definition, but not the kind of history education that we find in indoctrinative education systems or triumphalist narratives that erase wrongdoing, but the kind of history curriculum that I think, by and large, in fits and starts, Canada has been trying to work out, and that is evidence-based and tries to be representative. And I don't know if doing history education means that history is good or that that's a good use of history. I just think it's necessary. There's no way around it. I think a society that doesn't teach and study history is a society that doesn't know itself and that is not well poised to meet the challenges of the future. I think there's less history education than there used to be. I think that young people are less concerned about learning history than they used to be, in part because they feel like they can always just look it up because everything is available at their fingertips, or so it seems. This is another one of the misleading beliefs about technology. It's true that you can look things up, but that's not the same as learning it before you need to know it, learning it before the question occurs to you to go and look it up, and learning it in a more systematic way where you are reading things and putting the pieces together instead of scanning a Wikipedia page because you just saw a movie where a particular event came up and now you're wondering about that event. It's wonderful to have the Wikipedia page and all of that at our fingertips. It's not the same as meaningful, ongoing history education. It's another connection perhaps to AI and the increasingly digitized world. Studies show this. People think they don't need to learn as many things. It's almost an unconscious belief. We just become cognitively lazy because we know that we could, in 3 milliseconds, get an answer to any question we might have. That's not the same as learning.
So there's a dumbing down process, quote unquote, that seems to be happening.
I think there is. And I think that there's conflating getting a factual answer with having a real education in something that allows you to see the world through that knowledge and understanding.
Are there any final thoughts you'd like to share about history? Or was there something that you wanted to say earlier that you didn't get a chance to?
I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I think it's interesting for me to work through how much I feel that history influences me even though I am not a historian, and how much history even shows up in my academic work in philosophy, even though I'm not a historian. It just seems to prove the idea that without history, you can't understand anything else.
Lauren Bialystok, thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. It's been a pleasure.